Charlie Yankee Echo Sierra Traffic Dare Alpha Sierra X-Ray Golf Sierra Alpha taking
In today's
off runway
episode of The
3
Naturalist, we're going to return to the fiasco that is the state of forests and forestry in the province of New Brunswick. Here, the Acadian forest is heavily endangered by the direct actions of forestry companies, which have been, at an unbelievable rate, destroying the native Acadian forest to replace it with conifer wood pulp plantations. This means that native biodiverse forests, consisting of deciduous and coniferous trees and their natural understory flora and fauna, are being systematically destroyed en masse to meet the industrial production goals of certain local companies heavily invested in timber and pulp production, though there are many companies that operate in the background that are also behind this, operating behind the scenes by investing in the purchase of mass tracts of land, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres to convert to these tree farms. And farms, by their very nature, are not biodiverse. They, of necessity, focus on the production of certain species of plants or animals for food or other products. This in itself is not bad, unless farms expand to the point that they completely remove and devastate the local ecologies, which is the case when it comes to forestry in New Brunswick and forestry throughout much of the provinces and states that once formed the Acadian forest. Apparently, these videos are threatening enough that certain persons high up in the ranks of forestry in New Brunswick had to, try to discredit them. And to that end, the executive director of Forestry New Brunswick, or I should say the former executive director, actually posted an article describing the first video I created about the state of forestry in New Brunswick as, how do I put it, grandstanding, melodramatic, and theatrical. Those weren't his exact words, but the gist of his article. You can read it here yourself. Here's the link. And I did a response to that article, which you can see here. The gist of it is that everything is just fine with the state of forest in New Brunswick. Well, to those persons who feel threatened by these videos, I'm happy that you feel threatened by these videos. It's about time the truth is told. Now, it doesn't take me to tell the truth. The fact is, anybody can get on a product like Microsoft Flight Simulator and fly over the landscape. And the landscape that you will see with Microsoft Flight Simulator is based on actual satellite data. But you don't need a high-end computer and Microsoft Flight Simulator to do this. For that matter, these days, anybody with access to a tablet or a computer or a data phone can pop onto the internet and simply see the direct satellite imagery. And if you happen to live in New Brunswick, all you have to do is get a couple miles outside of any town, city, or farming area and drive the back roads. Drive until you see what looks like a dirt back road going back into nowhere, and I doubt you'll even have to go a mile before you start to find the clear cuts. Quite literally, the evidence of the devastated states of New Brunswick's Acadian forest is inscribed indelibly in the land, and it cannot be denied. All you have to do is go and look. Outside of the province's few national and provincial parks, it is extremely difficult to find a bit of forest land where the local ecology has not been severely damaged. So far, I've covered wide portions of central, southern, and eastern New Brunswick. In today's video, possibly the last video I'm going to make on this topic, I'm going to cover western New Brunswick, all the way from Edmundston to Boston Brook, and then south down to the coast at St. Stephen. I may make another video covering northern New Brunswick, running from about Edmundston to Burnsville, but at this point it's beginning to become superfluous. I mean, there is such a weight of evidence depicting in graphic reality revealed through satellite imagery the devastated state of New Brunswick's native forest that how much more evidence is needed, really? At this point, a vast amount of undeniable evidence indicates a need for a change in New Brunswick. The offices that administer things such as environmental protection and forest protection, species protection, and the government itself is heavily corporate captured. Persons with corporate interest of some kind or another hold key roles. And that is why New Brunswick has become one of the country's and perhaps North America's leading users of products such as glyphosate, which are sprayed over the forest to kill the native flora and turn the land into pulp farms, while the entire province is effectively converted into a vast tree farm. A radical change is needed. Old liars need to be elected out, and old bulls full of corporate interests firmly entrenched in these offices and ministries need to be removed. It's time to take real action in New Brunswick's next elections if things are ever going to get any better, because the status quo it's codependent. It's truly sick. So we've already taken off from the Edmundston area, and we are flying in the Microsoft Flight Simulator toward Boston Brook now. And you'll notice in the top right of the screen that I have placed an image depicting the route by way of satellite map. We're going to be taking the northern route, going directly to Boston Brook. And for this entire flight, I have placed up in the upper right corner of the screen the satellite imagery depicting the route. I've done this because in summer months, which is what I've set the flight simulator to show, clear-cut forest will show greenery unless it's been very freshly cut. And that's the growth of weeds and shrubs which eventually fill up that open area. And so unless conditions are right, it can be very hard to tell what is clear-cut forest with the naked eye given the time of year. That's why in the Forestry New Brunswick live flight video that I posted last year, the flight was made toward autumn. When the green foliage subsides, it's much easier to see from the air how much damage there is and how widespread it is. But when you get some additional altitude, like you get with satellite imagery, the overall changes become much more visible. Now in this area, as with most of New Brunswick, anywhere away from the roads, you tend to see a patchwork of different coloration, which generally indicates that at some point in the past, regions of forest have been cut down and are at various stages of regrowth. However, near the roads, you also see discoloration, some of it red-brown, some of it pale green, and those are areas of farms. Usually you can tell areas of farms from areas of industrial forestry by various telltales. Industrial forestry likes to cut in large rectangles or squares for one. They generally run dirt roads to or through the areas that they're clear cutting, as you see below in the main imagery. And the heavy machinery used to make those clear cuts leaves striations in the earth. And if you back up to about 6 minutes and 39 seconds and look below, you can see the striations that I'm talking about. During the summer, the work of industrial forestry is easily overlooked from the air because of all the greenery that you see below. Persons trained in the interpretation of aerial images will spot the problems more readily. But if you aren't used to interpreting imagery from the air, it's very difficult to see. I mentioned in a previous video I first started studying aerial imagery interpretation in geology courses many years ago, and it's not an intuitive skill. We humans, we just aren't instinctively equipped to understand what the landscape looks like or what those appearances mean when we're looking at it from thousands and thousands of feet above. By the way, right now this virtual flight is set for about 3,500 feet above sea level. Though later on, just before we reach St. Stephen, we will increase to about 6,000 feet just to gain a little bit more perspective over the flat landscape. But compared to many other regions in New Brunswick, this area is not so bad. It's not to say that it's good, but there is a lot of farmland in this area, and mostly what you see down there is just patchwork farms. The clear cuts are well off the road, and they stand out less by comparison to other areas of New Brunswick. In the description, I've provided links to the satellite imagery so you can study full-size images on your own if you wish to do so. But from Edmundston to Boston Brook, we're mostly going to pass over a patchwork of farms, and a bit away from them, forests in various stages of either being clear-cut or perhaps that have been left alone to stand as hunting areas or woodlots. If only this were the status throughout New Brunswick. Like I said, it's not a great status, not when we're looking at preserving old-growth forests and old-growth species, especially in consideration of the essential contributions these types of forests make toward a healthy environment. But in the grander scheme of New Brunswick, it's not so bad. Let's go ahead and skip ahead to Boston Brook and you'll see what I mean. So it's about 54 kilometers between Edmundston and Boston Brook. And over that 54 kilometers, the landscape begins to make a radical transformation. Going from a patchwork of farms and woods to what from the air can only be interpreted as a vast industrial tree farm. If you're on the ground, it would stretch from horizon to horizon. And indeed, if you look at the satellite map, you can see that the landscape is divided up into square sectors. Mostly, these are forestry access roads. And if you follow the link to this particular map, you can see that the open land and the forest itself are filled with the striations that indicate the activity of industrial forestry. Our patchwork of farms and woods closer to Edmundston has fundamentally transformed into a vast pulp plantation. So the autopilot has taken us through a gentle turn to starboard and lined us up towards St. Stephen, way down on the south side of the province, right near the coast. I'll leave it to continue to fly so that we can take a good look around outside our virtual aircraft, though it's painful to look at. A vast landscape that was once forest but now is actively in the process of being clear-cut. While its native trees, the trees which make it true Acadian forest, are systematically and strategically removed, sometimes through mechanical means, but often through vast, multi-tens of thousands of gallon applications of glyphosate, and possibly other herbicides. God only knows what Forestry in New Brunswick is actually doing. They're fairly secretive about their activities. There are records out there, but you have to dig around to get them. But look, every direction that you look, what you're seeing is a cut-over landscape. Literally every direction that you look, as far as you can see, from 3,500 feet in the air. That's as if you were to climb up on top of a mountain and look out in every direction and saw a cut-over landscape. That's how far off you're seeing. For those that might be new to these videos, I want to explain to you why I use the Microsoft Flight Simulator to portray these videos. Those of you who have seen other of these videos will already know. The Microsoft Flight Simulator does not invent the landscape that you're seeing. The landscape is presented through a process called photogrammetry. When a virtual plane flies over a landscape, the software examines satellite imagery of that region, and through the magic of photogrammetry presents that region in a three-dimensional perspective so that when you fly over it virtually through the Microsoft Flight Simulator, what you see is very, very close to what is actually there. In fact, the software aims to be so real that it can also be set to present the current weather conditions, as well as relating any air traffic in the region. Though right now I have the flight simulator set to portray the landscape during a June day on a day that it's only partly cloudy, because winter landscapes mainly just come out as all white, and well, lately in the maritime provinces it's been cloudy for weeks, cloudy and stormy that is, and there wouldn't be much visibility of any detail from the air. But ultimately, the Microsoft Flight Simulator, what you see in these videos is what is portrayed through satellite imagery, which means what you see is what is actually there, such as that gigantic clear cut on the right, lower right, and the area that's been sectioned off to be clear cut in the middle. Well, I mean, the landscape in every direction as far as you can see is either in the process of being clear cut or sectioned off to be clear cut, or presently in process of the trees being farmed and prepared to be clear cut, which means that the native forest has to be removed to make way for the coniferous trees that are desired by the timber and especially the pulp industry. Everywhere you go, as far as you can see, for countless miles, this is the landscape of northwestern New Brunswick, and it will be the landscape you will see until we get very close to St. Stephen, where it will begin to transition back into farmland and then ultimately to the landscape you would see around a small town and its suburbs. And if you look to the upper right or follow the link in the description to the actual satellite image, well, in truth, you would be even more disturbed. Because from the air, you can only see out so far. I mean, you can technically see to the horizon, but as you can see, the more you look toward the horizon, the blurrier it becomes. Part of that is due to atmospheric distortion, and part of that is simply due to the landscape flattens as you look out into the distance. But when you look at it straight down as from a satellite image, you can see that for endless miles in every direction, this entire landscape is a tree farm. I don't honestly know if there's a square acre down there that is not a tree farm right now. Technically, the forest industry is supposed to leave land around bodies of water uncut. They're supposed to leave a sort of buffer between their activities and bodies of water, but when you've essentially hollowed out the rest of the landscape, does it really matter? The shade might keep the water cool, but there isn't all that much habitat for the species that rely on that forest to dwell in. Once again, as there is satellite imagery portraying all the landscape that you can study, we won't fly through the entire thing. I don't feel I honestly have to prove how bad the forest situation is in New Brunswick anymore. We're just going to jump ahead to the next sector of this flight. We're now flying over the region that lies just east and south of the Perth Andover area. And off to the right, around the river valley, there are a great many farms, and beyond them the usual areas sectioned off for clear cuts. Below us, in north, south, and east, we once again find an entire landscape simply transitioned into a tree farm for the pulp and timber industry. And as with the region just north that we flew through, it's like this pretty much as far as you can see. The bright roads down there are dirt roads that are typically used by the forestry industry, and the striations in the landscape indicate active tree farming operations. Generally, where the photogrammetry doesn't relate the striations, it's because a clear cut is at some point of regrowth, or it's getting close to the point where the forestry industry considers it time to cut. If there is, by some chance, a region down there of actual natural Acadian forest, odds are very high that it is on the chopping block, so to speak. The goal will be to remove the native trees, especially the native deciduous trees, as well as all the undergrowth, the native foliage, and replace that with the coniferous trees that the pulp and timber industry finds desirable. Between the footage of the actual flight and the satellite imagery, which you can see up in the top right, and you can follow the link to see that image enlarged, I think we can go ahead and jump ahead to the next leg of our flight. And unfortunately there too, just as here, you'll see that once you're away from any little country road, it's just clear cuts and tree farms as far as the eye can see. So this is the region lying around Centerville and Heartland, and we're flying directly over the landscape just east of them both. And we've now flown about halfway between Edmundston or Boston Brook and St. Stephen to the southwest of the province right on the coast. We won't spend too long here because, well, you can see for yourself, both from the satellite imagery as well as from the imagery portrayed directly by the flight simulator, that it's just more of the same. There are some houses and farms down there, but as soon as you get away from them, the landscape is just divided up to, once again, be a tree farm for the pulp and timber industry. The photogrammetry portrays the landscape down here in a bit better shape, however, the satellite imagery disagrees. When they disagree, generally you should go with the satellite imagery. The satellite imagery shows many bare patches. The reason for that is the photogrammetric technology is relatively new, and it's designed to interpret the landscape along known parameters. Rough green becomes forest, while smooth, lighter patches of green become meadows, and so on like that. So when the photogrammetry encounters the green shrubbery growth and large clear cuts, sometimes it thinks that it's a forest down there. If in doubt, always go back to the satellite imagery. And if you follow the link and look at the expanded view of this particular satellite imagery, what it portrays are large swaths of clear cuts and land in the process of being tree farmed. If any persons viewing this video happen to live in the area though, I would love to hear from you about what the landscape is like in that area. Is it better than the photogrammetry and the satellite imagery is portraying here? Sometimes the satellite imagery is a bit old, but usually no more than a few years. Is it worse? Did you buy a cottage or a farm that used to be surrounded by lovely woods and is now surrounded by a clear cut? Or to be fair, has it gotten better since you've gotten there? I would love to hear your unbiased and honest opinions of what the land is like around you. And if you think the government and the environmental protection and forestry offices are doing their job, or if they are failing you. I've gone ahead and skipped ahead to the Southampton leg of this journey, because as in all cases previously, all we would have seen flying over the entire interior is a landscape turned entirely into a tree plantation at some place between having been clear-cut and being prepared to be clear-cut. As before, we won't spend too much time here because, well, as you can see, we're just going to encounter more of the same. The difference being that as we get further south and get closer to more settled areas, we'll start to see more villages and suburban settlements within this region, and the clear-cuts will, well, I'm not going to say they don't occasionally occur right beside the farms and villages and suburbs and such, but in general they're going to be a little more out of the way. But here we are flying out of the way. We're flying that same route from Boston Brook down to St. Stephen, and as you can see, the forest down there is divided up by forestry access roads with clear cuts everywhere. Essentially, it's just more of the same story, and please bear in mind that I have done this virtual flight and you can see the satellite maps yourself, tracing all the way from Edmundston eastward to Boston Brook and then south down to St. John's, and it is the same story. And unless I'm passing over a national park, it's the same story for the entire province of New Brunswick. I've done many virtual flights over New Brunswick that I haven't captured and turned into videos for the Naturalist channel. I've looked at satellite imagery of the province from one corner to the other. Pilots have actually sent me imagery of their live flights over the region, and it's like this wherever you go in New Brunswick. The Acadian forest of New Brunswick is in a very bad place right now. The ecology of the province is endangered. It is no secret among scientists that the Acadian forest ecosystem is itself endangered, and it's due to things like this. Vast regions where the Acadian forest once grew have been turned into playgrounds for the pulp cartel and the timber cartel. And there's big money in this. The pulp and timber cartels have gone to great effort to create corporate capture of ministries which are supposed to administer environmental protection, forest protection, and to capture governments as well. Which is fundamentally why, though New Brunswickers continually make an outcry against the massive use of pesticides such as glyphosate throughout the province, it falls on deaf ears. The government doesn't care. Their vested interests, if not in their political positions, is in the corporate positions they're going to get after they're done with their offices. That's what corporate capture does. That's how it works. We aren't going to spend too long here for the same reason as in previous sections of the video. I would just be dragging out the pain, and if you need to see for yourself, if you need to confirm for yourself how bad the situation is, if what you see in the actual footage from the flight simulator is not convincing, just take a look at the satellite imagery, because the evidence is right there. It just cannot be denied. It is literally inscribed in the land. It's readily visible from space, readily visible from the air. I've jumped ahead to just north of St. Stephen. This is the last leg of our virtual journey, where our virtual aircraft would soon be landing just north of the southwest coast of New Brunswick. And as in all cases previous, you can see the same story inscribed in the land. There are some settlements down there, yes, but there are forestry access roads everywhere, and where there aren't people, there is, well, a landscape which is, for lack of a better word, pulp and timber plantation. So without aiming to repeat what I've said over and over again, that there just honestly is no further point in making these videos, as this is the story of the New Brunswick landscape from one corner to the other, northeast, southwest, and central. But I think it's worth adding a few thoughts on this matter. What has happened to the landscape in the forest of New Brunswick is that forestry has become something like a vast open pit mine. Pit mines have long been known for their damage and risk to the landscape, and when we're talking about mining resources, whether it's gold or uranium or lithium or whatever the case may be, at least it's more localized. But the forest and the landscape of New Brunswick itself, the entire province, has essentially been turned into what we might call a landscape mine. The trees are mined, and just as pit mines transform and change the landscape irrevocably and always harmfully, this practice of pit mining or open pit mining the landscape has changed, it's changed the entire nature of New Brunswick. And just as pit mines invariably do, it has introduced many problems to New Brunswick. Forests capture water, and without them, flooding becomes a problem. Forests prevent erosion, and without them, erosion becomes a problem. And forest fires have become a problem and will continue to do so. The Acadian forest itself was extremely resilient to fire. Acadian forests, hardwoods in general, do not like to burn, and they strongly resist it. I did a video on that topic, which is linked here if you want to see for yourself. Conifers catch readily, and hardwoods resist burning. Forest fires will become more and more of a problem in New Brunswick. And there will be increasing spread of pathogens, tree diseases, as well as pests such as spruce beetles, because as the forest is turned more and more into a giant virtual monocrop of conifers for the pulp and timber industry, the lack of biodiversity creates a playground for pest and disease. Just as the Acadian forest was naturally extremely resistant to fire, it was also extremely resistant to the spread of pathogens and pests, because biodiversity meant that pathogens and pests had to travel to find one suitable host or another. But when a pest or a pathogen finds itself in New Brunswick, it finds itself in the heart of an immense province-wide buffet. If it preys on conifers or species that like to grow on conifers, it will take, grow, spread wildly, and be extremely difficult to control. And what all this means for New Brunswickers, and all of us who share life in the maritime provinces, is that the devastation of our forest and our environment to serve the desires of a tiny minority of people and industries, this pulp and timber industry and their corporate captured government serviteurs, well, we're all going to have to pay the price for it. There is time to turn it around. There is still a remnant of our native ecology left, but every year it's smaller, every year it's less. And the clock to turn this around, the clock to effectively deal with it, it is ticking. And eventually it will reach and strike the midnight hour. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of natural science and environmental issues. If you like our program, please take a moment to subscribe and like.
Autumn leaves are turning brown, branches bare.